we are again, Mike, in the
Yes.
Aberdeenshire countryside.
This is Colin Percival,
And this is Mike Cooper.
and collectively we're known as Mike Cooper and Colin Percival. We're going to have to work on a more catchy name, won't we? So the occasion is the 60th anniversary of the GESGB. What does that stand for again, Colin?
It's the Geoscience Energy Society of Great Britain.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I knew I had you here for some reason or another. So this was the book that came out around about 1980, I guess. It covered the first 30 years, tales from the early UK oil exploration, compiled and edited by Richard Moreton. It was available through what was then known as the PESGB, now known as the GESGB. But it's the period since that time, from 1980 to the current present day, 2024. What's going on this slide?
Well, the first thing I should say is that myself and Mike entered the industry around about 1980, but the chart on the right there shows you the discoveries that have gone on to be producing fields split by decade, and you can see the decline from 225 before 1980 through to 22 for the last decade. Now obviously there will be a bit of a delay between discovery and getting into production, so you would expect a little bit of a decline, but you can see the heyday in terms of the North Sea really occurred before 1989.
So taking us back to 1979, here's a few of the images. Margaret Thatcher had just become the new Prime Minister. Pink Floyd had a Christmas #1. And these were the pop socks you used to wear, is that right, Colin?
Well, not publicly. But yeah, it was interesting when Margaret Thatcher came to power that she knew that there were two industries that were doing well, the bank and oil and gas, and therefore the big push was for more oil and gas from the North Sea.
And probably signalled the end of the coal industry as well.
Absolutely.
On this slide, we've listed all those discoveries that were made prior to 1980. So very small writing here. Lots of the big fields were found in this early phase. There are too many really to name, but we just picked out one or two.
Yeah, we just thought we'd highlight a few fields there just to give you a flavour for what was going on at the time and some of the things that were thought to be happening in terms of the geology in the North Sea. So Forties, discovered by BP, mapped at the pink horizon. Everything at BP was mapped at the pink horizon, which was top border, big discovery, but originally the reservoir was thought to be deltaic. Subsequently became a submarine fan, so that just shows you the state of knowledge at the time. And then Magnus, also mapped at the pink horizon, didn't discover anything of any significance in the tertiary, but a deeper target in the Jurassic came in, which was slightly surprising at the time.
Both platforms I actually visited in my youth. Didn't get to West Sole though. What was the story of
West Sole, yeah, the first producing gas field in the UK, drilled on licence P001. And it's very interesting actually in terms of the data quality at the time. Obviously there's only some 2D lines of very poor quality. A chap called Jim Hornibrook at BP mapped it up as a time closure. Really, time closures in the southern North Sea are spurious in the sense that nobody understood the trickeries of depth conversion due to velocity variations in the overburden. But it was a discovery. The reservoir is pretty poor, but it's fractured, so there was wide variation in flow rates between wells. Some of them very low, single figures in terms of million cubic feet per day, but others were good. And it went on to produce for over 50 years.
It's been a great field. Now, we must say at this point that a lot of the examples here are actually BP fields or BP involved in, and that's because, well, that was your background, and indeed that was the company I initially worked for as well. What about Clare?
Well, Clare, yeah, big discovery west of Shetland. It was described at the time as a long sausage-shaped deposit of heavy oil west of Shetland. It took about 20 years to get it on stream.
Oh, I like a good sausage. And Ninian.
Ninian, just an example of the fault blocks in the Brent province. At the time, people could only map base Cretaceous, and the target was a sand on the base Cretaceous unconformity, which didn't exist. But they went through the unconformity and found a Jurassic reservoir beneath it, which provides the main reservoir in the East Shetland Basin in fields like Brent, Ninian, Cormorant.
Went to two of the three platforms there. Ninian Central, absolutely enormous. At the time it was built, it was the largest man-made object that had ever been moved. But as Magnus, huge platform, but it was actually Hutton TLP, which was the one that really blew me away. the technology at the time. It was the first tension leg platform in the North Sea, and it was a fantastic piece of engineering. There's one thing that all these fields have in common, and it's a list we kind of put together, and you can see no decent imaging, we didn't have detailed depth conversion, no 3D, we didn't have workstations with all paper sections,
coloured pencils, hand timing sections,
absolutely,
folding paper.
Yes.
We're all very skilled at that.
Yeah, that was right, and it predates the downhole pressure measurements, which have become vitally important, in assessing a discovery. Although horizontal drilling was around, it wasn't really to the same extent, and we've put in deep water drilling here, which really only kind of gets to affect West of Shetland. The North Sea is not that deep, so we can use sort of conventional semi-submersible rigs. AVO, on that list there, which are the real ones that, for you stand out? We use all of these techniques today.
Sure.
We didn't use them when all these major discoveries were found.
No, absolutely, and we were dealing with imaging was very poor. We had 2D seismic, a coarse grid, poor quality data. Been a transformation in terms of image enhancement with 3D and all the processing techniques that come on. And obviously the ability to manipulate all that data, both from a computing point of view and with workstations. Say previously, things like AVO analysis, you couldn't really undertake it because you were dealing with paper sections.
Absolutely. I mean,
that was a bit tricky.
that's amplitude versus offset for those not familiar with it. But
you were lucky to get a full stack data set, let alone angle stacks and things like that.
Absolutely. We had RAP sections, as I recall, were relative amplitude preserved, I think it stood for. So you could actually see some standout, peaks, some anomalies where you had high amplitudes, but that was about it. BCU and BPU, what's that about?
That's the base Cretaceous unconformity, which really relates mainly to central and northern North Sea, and the base Permian unconformity in the southern North Sea. And in both those areas, the main reservoirs, or many of the reservoirs, lie beneath those unconformity surfaces, and you couldn't image beneath them.
Yeah. Despite all of that, or not having those techniques, the vast majority of the reserves were unlocked in this period of time. So if we have a look back at production, and you can see by year on the bottom axis and by the amount on the y-axis, we've highlighted there 1980. That's the red dashed line. You can see the bulk of both the oil production, which is the graph on the top, and the gas production, which is the graph on the bottom. The majority of production actually post-dates 1980, not surprisingly. At the time, some of the engineering required to put rigs and platforms out into the harsh environment of the North Sea in West of Shetland, it just was groundbreaking at the time. Nowadays, we kind of take it a lot for granted, but you can see that all the production really came after 1980.
Yeah, and peaked around sort of the year 2000. You can see the steep decline after that, flattening out in the sort of 2010 to 2020 period with a sort of minor bump there. But recently, production has been declining at around about 10 or 11% per year.
And, our prediction is that with some of the tax changes that are expected imminently, that decline is going to increase. So if you move on here's a list of all the discoveries that went on to production. And these were the discoveries made in the 1980s. Now, 216 fields were discovered in the 1980s. It really was, the sort of the golden decade, and we were lucky enough to be involved, in companies who were, rigs were coming over the horizon. We were having to try and figure out where to drill wells. It was a very, very exciting period of time in the development of the basin.
Yeah, busy time, but really enjoyable. So we've highlighted some of the discoveries there, and we'll talk about a few of those just in terms of, again, what was happening and the knowledge base at the time. So Alba, which is starred at the top there, you can see it on this list here. It's an Eocene discovery which was found due to the fact that a well location for a deeper target had to be moved due to a pipeline. and something that was virtually invisible on the seismic came in as the Alba field, which has been producing for decades now.
We'll tell a similar story when we come on to look at Scalti. Cavendish.
Yeah. Cavendish was a Southern North Sea Carboniferous discovery. Up until that point in time, most of the discoveries had been four-way dip closures, or they had structural closure of some sort, the base Permian unconformity. Cavendish wasn't. It was a three-way dip with an up-dip truncation, basically, so that was something new. Cook is an interesting story in that it kind of typifies the Fulmar at the good end of the spectrum, produced well beyond its original sanctioned volumes.
We did get a little bit of flack that a lot of these fields were actually BP, and I call out to both James and Dave for making that point, saying, well, Shell are rather unrepresented, but Cook was an enterprise discovery, but Shell operated the development. One single well, and that one well on that field has produced, I think, best part of 60 million barrels.
Yeah, 57 or 58 million barrels out of one well. It's astonishing, really. But that's the Fulmar when it works well. Hyde is an interesting one because basically it's the other half of West Sole. And when they developed West Sole, they only developed the southern part of the structure and just designated a line on a map beyond which they weren't going to develop, which was called a deed of variation. So eventually the sort of northern closure on West Sole was developed as Hyde as a separate field.
And it wasn't really a separate structure?
Not at all. It's the same structure.
Yeah, there's a few of those around. Lagan.
Lagan's an interesting one. This was a Shell discovery, Lagan.
Oh.
I think Shell and Britol discovered it originally, but it was gas west of Shetland, so at the time it was seen as being uneconomic. Subsequently licensed by Total and partners, and as soon as Total licensed it, they immediately decided that the gas volume wasn't big enough to develop and wanted to drill down dip to find oil, which we never found. So eventually it got developed as a gas field together with a gas discovery next door, Tormore. And unfortunately, after they'd developed Lagan and Tormore, they discovered oil down dip on Tormore, which they didn't want to do at that point in time. So Total went out to discover oil, couldn't find it, and when they didn't want to find it, they found it.
But that oil's never been developed and unlikely that it ever will be.
Yeah, and then Cleeton and Ravenspur North, I just want to talk about these very briefly because given the West Sole story, as I say, it was a poor reservoir and it was known that the reservoir pinched out northwards. A mate of mine, old Badger, was given the job as a technical assistant of mapping the northern bit of P001, which West Sole sits in, for relinquishment, and he came up with a couple of structures which eventually got drilled. And actually, particularly Cleeton, has excellent reservoir properties. So it just goes to show you can write off areas on limited knowledge.
Now lastly, we've got, well, that looks like a fish, a fossil fish, and it looks like it's got a couple of wings.
Yes, is that the flying fish of the North Sea?
It may well be the flying fish of the North Sea.
It landed pretty good though when it landed.
and we both know the story of this, but yeah, it was Marathon were operating the Breer field, and they thought sedimentologically, and you're a sedimentologist, so... Well,
yeah, Breer sits in the hanging wall of the sort of bounding fault of the South Viking Graben, so... to the west there's a Fladenground Spur, which is a provenance area for sediment, and you get these fans developed in the hanging wall, which Marathon interpreted as alluvial fans, and therefore they couldn't see any way of getting sand further out into the basin. All of it was essentially trapped against the bounding fault. But there was a big discovery made outboard, which was Miller, because it turned out that the alluvial fan sands were in fact submarine fan sands. Again, it shows you how things have developed in the North Sea in terms of understanding.
So moving on to the 1990s, and we've got 127 fields that were discovered and went on to production. So we've excluded in all these lists, we've excluded all the discoveries that haven't been developed, even to this day. So 127, we've highlighted some of them there, which you might be able to read, but some of the highlights from this. Colin, talk us through 90 wells in 1 year.
Yeah, 90 wells in 1990, drilled by BP. And we started, and this was a commitment to the UK government to hand over the golden share in Britol. So BP had acquired Britol, but the government, which was a public quoted company, but the government held one golden share, which it would only hand over if certain criteria were met. And one of them was to drill 90 wells in 1990. And of course, we started off with our prospect inventory, working down from the top, drilling our best prospects first. Trouble was, by about mid-year, we'd only drilled about a dozen wells, and we made quite a lot of discoveries. We had to accelerate the well count in the second half of the year, and some blocks, like 923B, which is the Harding block, had about a dozen wells drilled on them.
1520 was another block that saw a lot of activity, as I recall.
Yeah. Any. Be careful if you're looking at a BP well from 1990 to a tertiary target. It may have been drilled in a hurry.
Okay, we've got the three green blobs there, and the first of those up west of Shetlands, and that was this was the time for the discovery of Foinaven and Shalian.
Yeah, and I think in 1992 the UK discovered more oil than anywhere else in the world, and it was mainly west of Shetland. And Foinaven was the first discovery. It's a Paleocene pinch-out play. The exploration manager at BP at the time had basically said, we've never found any oil west of Shetland, apart from Clare, and we're not going to find any. Your job is to get us out of this province. So there was a gradual retreat towards Clare, with acreage being relinquished or sold. And 20424 and 20419, which is Foinaven blocks, sit pretty close to Clare. And BP didn't really want to drill it, but we had a couple of rigs on long-term contract. One of them was the Ocean Alliance. It turned out that you could get 103% tax relief if you drilled a well using the Ocean Alliance on a Britol block. We'd actually already discovered Foinaven, but we hadn't really recognised it. So there'd been a well drilled up dip very close to the pinch-out, which had discovered a very small amount of, they were described as shows at the time. So BP drilled down dip. It was a great piece of technical work actually done on it by the team at the time. Most of them had been let go. There was only one person left in the team. And discovered 20424A2, and a couple of sidetracks discovered Foinaven. And subsequently, next door, Shalian was discovered. They were the first oil developments west of Shetland.
Indeed. Now, the Southern North Sea, we've picked out Breer here, and Breer, it's not really sort of that big a standout field, but what it did was it actually pushed the northern boundary of significant discoveries, and this was a Carboniferous discovery?
Yeah, that's right. So the Carboniferous plain of Southern North Sea kind of occurs in the northern part of that basin, and most of the activity had taken place in the east. There'd been a series of discoveries there, generally in the youngest Carboniferous sands, the Westphalian or things going up towards the Stephanian. And Breer was essentially an extension of that to deeper reservoirs much further west.
Irish Sea, the Irish Sea would be known. We had the Morecambe field, it had been around for decades, but it was thought of and known as a gas basin. And then in the 1990s, it was Hamilton Brothers who actually drilled a series of wells out here. Yeah,
and found oil as well as gas. And the oil was seen as a bit of an anomaly, although the evidence had always been there, because onshore is the Formby oil field, which the reservoir is about a few tens of feet down and produced a small amount of oil. So in the southern part of the basin, the East Irish Sea, that is, the source rocks, which are Carboniferous, Bowland shales, are in the oil window. But offshore, we hadn't really penetrated any significant oil discoveries to this point in time.
And you mentioned Formby. Formby's located just north of Everton.
Where's that, Mike?
Well, that's in the city of Liverpool. And Formby's quite interesting because it's essentially it's Triassic. It's the new red sandstone is the reservoir, and it's actually sealed by the boulder clay, which is actually a glacial deposit from the last ice age. So it's a very, very it's almost a seep that has been trapped with very, very recent sediments. And the wells, I mean, they go down to about 40 metres. It's really, really shallow. And it was strategically important during the Second World War.
Yeah, it's so shallow that I remember seeing a chord description of the top of the reservoir where it had tree roots in it.
Excellent, excellent. So, on to 2000. What's going on here?
Well, year 2000, yeah. It had been sung about for years that we should all meet up. Jarvis Cocker had been saying this in the year 2000. Y2K bug was imminent and everybody was worried, but nothing really happened. Bob the Builder was a Christmas #1. Status quo was still rocking all over the world. Chelsea won the FA Cup, Dennis Wise man of the match. France won the Euros. You could get yourself a Nokia phone. People still have them, a PS2 or a Ford Focus, and Tony Blair was Prime Minister. What a start to the era.
That's the new millennium. So in the 2000s, or the noughties, the discoveries, well, the numbers have come down. So 64 fields, and you can see the list there. Again, these are the fields that went on to produce. And we've picked out a few standouts. Of course, one of the biggest fields today is Buzzard, and indeed Golden Eagle, biggest producing oil fields in 2023, 2024. And they're out in the Outer Moray Firth, and they have a bit of a story.
Yeah, because quite a few companies got out of Buzzard. It's a Jurassic stratigraphic trap, and it was seen as very high risk. So, I was involved with 19.5 and 21, which are the two northern blocks of Buzzard, and in fact contained Golden Eagle. And we were tasked, following BP's acquisition of Amoco and Arco, to reduce the exploration blocks, which numbered 180, down to less than 60 in 2 years. So it was inevitable that something would be discovered on some of them. Unfortunately, Buzzard was one of them. I think Amoco had a 4% chance of success on it, but it came in, and for many years has been the UK's biggest producing field.
And the thing about Buzzard was there was a down dip well that actually had a column of oil in it, and the argument was, did this extend quite a long way up dip? And it was really kind of pushing the limits again. A bit in the same way Breer did. It was basically as far west as pretty much any oil had been found, with the exception of Beatrice and the Inner Moray Firth. But it was in an area that didn't really have any significant discoveries. Ettrick was probably the closest at the time, and that had never been developed. So Buzzard was was kind of groundbreaking.
It was, and the integrity of the top seal and the bottom seal were kind of the issues. I remember talking to one of the partners at the time, and I said, what attracted you to it? And he said, it was the first thing I've seen in years at the potential of 1 billion barrels. To which I said, you mean there was very few wells in the area? He said, absolutely. And it came in.
It came in big time, and shout out to my pal Alan Booth, who was certainly in the mix in amongst all that.
Well, I remember sitting next to him at a dinner, convincing him what a great prospect it was before they took our acreage and the commitment well we had on it.
Sounds like Alan. Okay, Central North Sea, HPHC, that's high pressure, high temperature. And Colin, this was one that had sat in BP's portfolio for a long, long time. But it was massively, highly pressured, and I think there was a concern amongst the drillers that it couldn't be drilled up dip. That more or less the seal may have blown. It was very, very close to the fracture gradient, and technically it was just too challenging.
Yeah, I mean it was the biggest prospect in BP's inventory at the time, but the technical work they'd done on very poor data, I must admit, because it was a down dip well with no reliable pressures. The work they'd done on that suggested the top seal had been breached.
Well, there was no reliable pressure, there was no reliable logs either.
No.
They only had the mud log in the well. But, at that time, I was with Kerr McGee, and we saw the potential and thought it was actually, very, very interesting opportunity. And we then farmed into BP. So
you did, made a big discovery.
It was fantastic, really.
And I think the moral of the story there is, the interpretation is only as good as the data quality.
And and sometimes you don't have the best data in the world, but you still have to go ahead
Yeah.
You know, if the prospect could be potentially be big enough, you've got to drill it. We've picked out another central North Sea opportunity. This is a small pool. I'm just going to tell a quick story about Scalty. Now, it's a very small field, probably 8-10 million barrels. And kind of got a couple of cartoons here. Scalty, it was in quadrant 21, block 8, and it was the third well in the block. It was targeting a Jurassic target. Now, didn't actually think that there was much likelihood that this was going to come in. So when we were planning it, that was the original plan. But when we looked at the shallow section, we could see lots and lots of pock marks on the seabed, which is indicative of escaping gas at the seabed. And also we could see some bright anomalies, quite shallow. And these were sort of shallow gas, maybe biogenic gas, that really we had to be avoided, because they can be quite troublesome and cause a shallow blowout. So what we decided to do was we found a very, very small area where we could actually locate a well, and the plan was that, well, now we'd seen this bright anomaly up in the tertiary here, which was went on to become Scalty. So we now had the opportunity to drill on down to this Jurassic commitment target, but go through this anomaly. And as you can see there, Scalty, it discovered an 80-foot oil column. So it's not a huge field, but kind of a nice story. Where the rig was located, there was no amplitude versus offset anomaly underneath it, whereas the bright AVO, that coincided with an undersaturated oil that was in the Scalty section. Now, it's a little bit unfortunate here, because I want to tell you how the nearby operator saw it. They looked at it, they saw where the rig was, and they saw that, the Scalty discovery had been made in an area where there was no AVO. So they said, well, that's interesting. We've got a prospect that doesn't have an AVO. So the AVO is probably associated with an up-dip gas column. So we can go ahead and drill our prospect. And so they duly went ahead and drilled a no AVO prospect. Well, guess what happened? It was a dry hole, and if only they'd asked, we would have said, well, we would have told them it was a deviated well and could have saved, probably at the time, I don't know, £15 million. The 2010s. Now we're down to only 22 fields, and as you said earlier, Colin, that's in part because there is a lag time between discovering and putting things on production. There's not too many wells on that list there, but we picked out a couple here. In the central North Sea, the Catcher field.
Yeah, Catcher was discovered by Onshore, one of your friends, Alan Booth, yet again, and everybody, including them, thought it would be heavy oil because it was up on the shelf west of the central Graben in the central North Sea, but it wasn't, and it's been good quality oil and it's produced very, very well. Tolmount was an interesting one. Originally drilled on a prospect called Scalty. The well was junked. Basically the rig was issue after issue. You know, we had a 47-day AFE for an 11,000 foot well, which was about 12 million quid, something like that. Day 47, we'd spent the 12 million quid and we were at 2,500 foot.
Ouch.
And we had no confidence in any forward projection of the time and cost to actually get to the reservoir. So we just stopped operations, decided we'd need to come back with a better rig and drill it properly. And we decided that we'd not only do that, but we'd farm out and essentially get a free well carry, because this was being drilled at the time by Dana. And we got ADTI, which is at the time was a division of Transocean, to give us a turnkey cost for the re-drill, which we had, which again was about 12 million quid. And our farming decided they could drill it cheaper. So we had to tell ADTI that they hadn't got the work. And then the farming drilled the well. 48 million pounds later, 2 planted bottom hole assemblies, and we are nowhere near the reservoir. We gave up. ADTI was so delighted that we hadn't given them the work, because they only get paid if they get to the earning depth. They took me out for lunch. Eventually, at the third attempt, it was discovered, and it's been a significant discovery in the southern North Sea in the classic Rotliegende reservoir. And I think, it came on stream when gas prices were very, very high due to the invasion of Ukraine, and paid back very, very quickly. And the prospect to the east, Tolmount East, also came in. And indeed a prospect to the west called Ern has also come in.
Good. And then on the onshore scene, picked out a couple there. Very recently we've had the Wrestle discovery up in, I think that might be Lincolnshire or something like that. Yeah, up in East England, onshore.
Yeah, probably Nottinghamshire, is it? Yeah, probably.
Somewhere
around East Midlands, UK.
Midlands, that'll do. Yeah. And that's been a nice little discovery. And then of course there was Horse Hill. Well, here's the headlines, and you can read them. Up to 100 billion barrels of oil now. The company UKOG, their share price rocketed up 200%, and
100 billion barrels discovered underground. I think you'd notice if it was overground.
It was like, really. I mean, at the time, this was a hard pill to swallow. We were had a bit of a chuckle.
Too big to swallow that pill.
And it would appear that this was essentially journalists that hadn't quite understood that there was potential in the basin that was significantly high, but the field, it's been producing now, but it hasn't produced very much at all. Maybe, I don't know, 1 million barrels or something. Just want to move on and talk about. We've been looking at discoveries that went on to produce. There are 482 undeveloped discoveries. Now, if we take a cost of around about 25 million pounds per well, today's prices perhaps, then that amounts to about 12 million pounds worth of exploration drilling that's been spent on these discoveries, and not a single one of them is producing. The NSTA, the regulator, they say of the order of 2.9 billion barrels of oil equivalent is in these discoveries. They're called contingent resources because they're not, they haven't been sanctioned, they aren't going to move ahead to development. What do you think about this? 482 undeveloped discoveries.
Yeah, and they've all been looked at individually, and most of them don't work as an individual development. So you need to put them together either geographically or around some sort of technology to move some of these forward. I do think there's an opportunity there for some of them. Obviously a lot of them will never be developed, but certainly some of them have the potential, because they've either got a reservoir issue, a size issue, or a fluids issue. You need, if it's something like a fluids issue, then you need to deal with that. And if you're going to deal with one, you might as well deal with several who that has the same problem.
There is a concern now that, are we going to see future licensing? Are people going to be able to put an area plan together so, one company can take control over several of these discoveries and develop them all together?
That's the biggest challenge at the moment. Fiscal regime that actually incentivises people to actually go out and develop these rather than just importing the products.
We've also got field redevelopments. Their potential, we see a number of opportunities to actually go back and redevelop fields where they've been abandoned or they've ceased production for decades and decades. Then there is the potential that the hydrocarbons actually worked its way back to the top of the structure. We're going to do a video on one of these examples in the not too distant future. But there's also, add to this list, any new finds, and we have very little exploration drilling ongoing, but there are some new finds being made even in 2024.
Yeah, we've only had 3 wells spudded year to date in the UK, which is an all-time low due to the fiscal regime that prevails at the time, which doesn't encourage new investment. But there's 15 billion BOE yet to find, according to our regulator in the UK, and we could access a significant portion of that if the numbers add up in terms of fiscal regime, which they don't at the moment.
You can see on the map on the right, the green dots, every one of those is an undrilled prospect. We haven't even included the leads, which would make it even denser. The green stretches from the west of Shetland, northern North Sea, out to Moray Firth, central North Sea, down to the southern North Sea. We have prospects in the Irish Sea and also over in Rockall. There are other opportunities across the border you can see, particularly in Norway, we see lots of potential. 2,500 almost undrilled prospects.
Yeah, absolutely. As Mike said, you can see where they're clustered. The activity that we've seen to date over the last few years has really been focused on smaller features, ILX, infrastructure-led exploration, so smaller features within tieback distance of existing infrastructure. Nobody's really looked at bigger features elsewhere. Everything, all the activity has been clustered around existing producing hubs. But there's a great opportunity set out there. As I've said, 15 billion BOEs is available. Big chunk of it is gas. That's not surprising. We've spent the last 60 years preferentially chasing oil, so what remains is somewhat depleted in terms of oil, so it's mainly gas, but a great opportunity set out there if we can get the numbers to add up.
A lot of demand for gas, and all of these data points in every one of those prospects, we have all the details in our TROVE database. Bear that in mind if you were looking at any regional study. Did a back of the envelope calculation here, giving them a geological probability of success of some 5%. That's 1 in only 20 of these would actually come in. And we can kind of get 49 new fields here, but none of it's going to happen under the present regime. And in fact, at times we think the UK North Sea is almost uninvestable right now.
Yeah, which is why we've seen decline rates of around about 11% last year. So UK production declined 11% in the last year. That was 14% for gas and 10% for oil, and that will just continue.
And possibly even accelerate. So in summary, the North Sea, despite the fact we're not drilling very many exploration wells, we are actually doing some appraisal drilling, and some of the developments have been going ahead. Others, they've just stalled. I mean, what's happening with Rosebank, with Cambo, 2 examples of fields which was even the redevelopment of Foynaven. What's happening there? But the North Sea delivers.
Yeah, it has done over the period 1980 to 2024. There's been some big discoveries. Production has peaked. West of Shetland has started up with Foynaven and Shalian, and eventually Clare. As Mike just hinted, there's some other potential big developments out there in terms of Rosebank and Cambo, and there's lots more to come in terms of exploration potential. But as we've highlighted, accessing this needs an appropriate fiscal regime. Other things that have happened, Mike?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've commented that what used to be the Petroleum Exploration Society has now become the Geoscience Energy Society. Basically the industry, a lot of people have moved into areas of the energy transition, into renewables. So looking at CCS, looking at geothermal.
Yeah, but so there's opportunities still exist in the mature areas for these new industries. We've seen that in Southern North Sea and East Irish Sea in terms of wind farms and carbon storage licences. Obviously that creates friction between various industries working in the same offshore space, but it's happening. The future can be fun.
Should be fun.
Will be fun.
Let us hope it is. And, for the younger geoscientists, we've spent the entirety looking at that little green box that's just come onto the screen there, just the UK area. Now there's the world, and every one of those green dots, they're all discoveries or fields right around the world, and lots of areas of the world, quite a lot of activity ongoing. But it's really in mature basins, the opportunities are a little bit more limited. So opportunities to work overseas, work with TROVE to actually become knowledgeable about some other areas of the world. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, and you'll get updates on when we have new videos out, and we do them on lots of different parts of the world. Did you want to say anything, or was that your stomach rumbling?
So the stomach rumbling, yeah.
You're getting hungry, you see, that's what it is.
Always hungry.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found that interesting. Please hit the like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Hope to see you back on our channel before too long. Bye for now.